Cowboy Christmas, 1890, by Doug Whitley. Read by Doug Whitley. It was cold. Jesse was wrapped in everything he owned just to keep warm. He had old sacking on his feet and legs. He could just feel the rains through his sheepskin choppers, and he must look pretty strange with a cut-up old blanket wrapped around his head over his hat to keep his ears from freezing and his nose from falling off. His horse couldn't be much warmer, knee-deep in the wet snow, the tethered pack mule following resignedly behind. Cautious step by cautious step, they made their way through the tree line, hoping to find shelter. He knew there was a tie-hack shack somewhere nearby. Whether he could recognize it in the snow was something else. Jesse didn't want them to find his frozen body atop his frozen horse with a frozen mule when the tie-hacks came to cut rail ties in the spring. He'd been making the circuit on the holdings, just checking on things for the railroad. They owned just about everything: the rails, the trees, the land, the lives. He saw some rabbit tracks in the snow ahead of him. He began watching to see where they led. Might still be around, he thought. Couldn't be too old and still showing this snow. Yeah. There he was, hiding. You just stay there a bit longer. Jesse eased the Colt out of its holster and slowly brought it to bear on the rabbit. The blast roared and the red splattered the snow crimson. He rode up to the carcass, stepped off his mount, hoping he wouldn't sink to his waist in the snow. He grabbed the limp animal by the hind legs and threw it over the saddle horn. Getting back up on his horse was harder than he thought with his feet wrapped up, standing in the deep snow, but he made it. He gave his mount a tap with his heels, and they plunged forward slowly like wading through deep water. He saw the shack, its angles at odds with the blanketing snow over the roundness of the boulders nearby. It wasn't much, maybe 8 feet by 10, put together with logs chinked with mud, a level roof of small pines with some flat rocks to hold it all together. It would hold his heat, keep out the worst of the cold. The small overhang would have to be enough for his animals. He cleared some drifted snow, enough for his horse and mule to stand free. He threw down some fodder from the mule's back. He grabbed the lantern and some oil and lit it with a match so he could see. He eased open the rickety door, hoping the leather hinges wouldn't come apart. Well, it's dry. There was a platform built into the wall to keep a body off the ground, a hand-sawn stump for a small table. It was better than sleeping out in the weather. He had enough provisions for a fortnight. He'd only been out a couple of days. There was a storm building. He might just sit it out here. Not much between here and the ranch if he got caught out in the weather. It was almost Christmas. Not that it mattered much to him. No family. Rachel and Jacob were long gone, killed by some rebel deserters while he was away fighting the Yankees. That was the last year of the war, just before the surrender at Appomattox. He'd been running ever since. Running is what brought him to Wyoming. It had taken him 25 years to get there. He was still running, but he was running out of places to go. It's hard to run when the thing you're running from is inside you. He skinned the rabbit, collected some squaw wood, and built a fire. He watched the smoke roll softly through the hole in the corner of the roof. The heat felt good. He took a small sip from his canteen. He began to peel off the layers that had kept him warm. They needed to dry. He needed to eat and sleep. The cold stole the heart as well as the heat out of you. Jesse had felt it draining out of him all day along the trail. He had enough food to last, but tomorrow he might hunt, just for something to do. He ate the rabbit, washing it down with more water. He finished unpacking the horses, wiped them down with some of the sacking, went back in, wrapped himself in his bedroll, and slept. He made coffee over the small fire and wrestled with buffalo jerky for breakfast, not sure who would win. The snow had continued to fall all night, and it was even deeper than the day before when he went out of the shack to check on the animals. He'd heard some elk bugling not too far away, and he thought he might like to find them. He wrapped himself up against the cold, strapped the snowshoes on his feet, and began to ease his way through the trees, looking, listening. Elk were one thing. Wolves were another. He wanted to make sure he was the hunter, not the hunted. He knew there were grizzly bears here as well, but they should be safely asleep in their dens. As he moved and listened, his mind returned to the past. It was always with him. The war, the death, the pain, the running. Slowly he was working toward the wind. He stalked through the trees, searching for game. It was in the silence after moving from behind a tree to a boulder the size of a buffalo that he heard the snort of an elk. It carried far in the cold stillness of winter in Wyoming. He stopped and began to search for the animal. His gaze moved farther and farther away until he spotted the majestic beast in a small clearing 200 yards ahead. He slowly brought the Winchester to bear and sighted down the iron sights of the long blue barrel. He took a deep breath, steadied himself against the rock, both eyes open. He slowly squeezed the trigger until the rifle leaped in his grasp as the bullet exploded from the barrel. The elk jumped with the sound, but even as he did, the bullet caught him in the shoulder and passed through the heart. He was dead in an instant. Jesse levered the casing out of the rifle and picked up the warm brass, putting it in his pocket. He shooed up to the elk, began to dress it out, took the hide, the antlers, as much meat as he could carry, knowing the wolves, the coyotes, and the pine martens would have the rest. It was late in the afternoon, with darkness falling fast, that he made his way back to the shack by the trail he had marked along the way. At the cabin, he threw a rope over a tree branch, tied it on the sack with the meat, raised it up out of the grizzly reach, hoping they were all safely hibernating for the winter, far away from him. He cooked the liver with some bacon he had in his pack, settled the animals for the night, laid down for his second night in the lonely cabin. It was December 22nd. It had been a good day. Running Doe pressed the canteen to her husband's fevered lips, and he felt his head. He was hot. The fever was taking him. She pulled the buffalo robe tighter around him, looking for the horse's head. Took it. She began again. The snow was deeper now and still falling. She could feel the child inside her stir and kick. Perhaps he would be a strong warrior like his father. She thought of her child as a man-child. She knew it was in the hands of the Father of Skies, but still she wanted a man-child. The thought kept her warm in the midst of this wearying cold. She trudged on. She was wrapped in a blanket she had traded for back at Fort Pierce, and another buffalo robe her father had given her when she was married. There was no food, but she would do something. Her father had taught her well before they were forced to live at Standing Rock Reservation. She would find food. With the snow, there would always be water. She walked on, leading the horse, dragging her fevered husband on the travois. Their tracks were quickly being covered by the falling snow. That was a good thing. She knew the soldiers were after them. How foolish to believe the ghost dancers. How foolish to believe that a white leather shirt would stop a bullet. Her husband had been one of the men guarding Sitting Bull when the reservation police came to arrest him. She grimaced as her unborn child kicked in her womb, as the memory of her husband stumbling into their cabin, his blood staining the white leather dark. She knew what had happened. She knew he had escaped. She packed a travel, rebandaged her husband's wound, wrapped him in the buffalo robe, and in the darkness made her stealthy way out of the reservation across the plains. That had been many days ago. She didn't know how many, but her steps had brought her many miles. Walk, stop to rest, see to her husband. Sleep whenever weariness took her. Rise, walk, stop, rise, walk, stop, over and over and over. Walk, rest, walk, stop. She had seen no one. She did not want to see anyone. She had crossed the Dakotas alone. People meant news of them. News of them meant soldiers. She walked on. The night came quickly in late December. They came to a stream with a rime of ice around the edges of the stones. She knew if she got wet she might freeze. She picked her way carefully stepping on the stones, praying the pinto would not stumble, that the travois would hold together. They made it safely to the other side. She drew the pony into the firs, unhitched the sledge, and pulled it and her husband under the shelter of the massive spruce. It was like a small teepee. The cover of needles underneath was soft, and the tree held its warmth. She settled the pinto, hoping he would find something to eat. She made her way quietly down to the stream. In the soft reflection of the fading light, she could see the shadows of the trout coasting in the current. She pulled back her sleeve and eased her ungainly form down to the water's edge. Slowly she put her hand into the icy water. The cold felt like fire running up her arm. She moved her hand ever so little and stopped. And again a little, and stillness. Gradually she was at the fish. It was a big one from what she could see in the gloom, enough for both of them, for 3 of them, for there was a living child inside her to feed as well. She eased her hand in the place. With a single motion, she swept the fish under the gills and onto the bank. She hit it with a stone to stop its thrashing. She couldn't start a fire because of the smoke. She cleaned the fish with her knife and stripped its flesh from its bones and fed herself, her child, and her wounded husband. She washed her hands in the stream, crawled in beside her husband to share his warmth and give him hers, and slept. She woke to the sound of bits and bridles, horses shod with iron. Through the branches of the tree she could see the soldiers on the far side of the stream. "What do you see, Walking Hand?" said the lieutenant. "Any sign of them?" "Nothing, Lieutenant." There was something, if only the foolish white man could read the signs, but he could not. Walking Hand would not give this woman away. She was only saving her man and the child from death. He had heard the stories of the arrest of Sitting Bull. He knew the white man's fears, but he knew the Lakota's fears too. Sitting Bull had been shot in the side and in the head when the Lakota police came to arrest him. An Indian shot by Indians. There was a struggle, shots were fired, people died. He had tracked her for many miles, but this was far enough. He knew the soldiers would not want to cross the water in the cold. He smiled at their weakness. "There is nothing. We have lost her in the snow. She will die soon anyway because of the cold. We will not join her." Slowly the column turned around, churning the snow and any signs of that others might read. They headed back toward the fort and the warmth of its barracks. The silence flooded in again. As Running Doe watched them turn, she knew the scout had seen the signs. She saw him search the far edge of the stream. She knew he saw her. He smiled. She could not hear his words, but she saw the horse soldiers go. She knew they would not search for her again. She crawled back beside her husband and slept. She awoke when her husband spoke in his fevered sleep. She scooped snow into her mouth, pressed some to his lips, hitched up the travois, and began to lead the pinto once again. The snow was deeper still, and going was hard. She knew that she had crossed the trail of the cows. She only hoped that the driving snow, they wouldn't be seen in the open flat land. She knew there were dangers, quicksand, alkali flats, other dangers. All day she headed west with the north wind pressing against her as she tried to hide on the shoulder of the pinto. It pulled at her. It wrapped around her husband under the buffalo robe. It tried to sink its fingers into her heart. She began to chant softly for Sitting Bull and the other braves who had died at Standing Rock, her voice snatched away by the wind and falling snow. The early darkness closed about them as they came into the woods of the Wyoming Territory. Each step seemed heavier than the last. Even the pony was having trouble in the deep snow. The branches of the firs around her were barely stirring. There was only the silver silence of the falling snow, the slightest whisper of snow on snow sifting gently down through the trees and branches of the darkening woods. The baby kicked, and she gasped in pain and surprise. Then she smelled it. The smoke and scent of meat cooking. The pony nickered in recognition of others of his kind somewhere ahead. She could feel him quicken, his head held high, looking, searching. Her mouth began to water as the scent drew nearer, winding its way in and around the forest through which she trudged. What would she do? Who was in the cabin she saw ahead? She crept closer, as silent as the wind in her swollen form. At that moment her husband cried out in Lakota, and the pony neighed loudly. In a flash the cabin door flew open, and the faint light spilled out into the night. In the doorway there was a man with a rifle pointed at her. The baby kicked, and her body collapsed as the contractions hit her. She cried out as she fell. Jesse put the rifle back in the cabin and sped forward. Kneeling beside the squaw, he gathered her up and bore her back to the shack. He laid her gently on the pallet he had prepared for himself. "My husband," Running Doe whispered. Jesse went back out and found the fevered man on the travois. He peeled back the robes and saw the blood. Even in the cold, he could smell the wound suppurating. In a moment, Jesse had the man inside, laid on the floor near the small fire he had going. "Help us, please," said the woman. Jesse put more wood on the fire and stirred the blaze. He knelt beside the man and began to uncover the wound. "The bullet's still inside him?" She nodded. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. There was no time for them now. He knew what needed to be done. He had seen it 100 times in the war. He had done it a few times himself over the years. Gently he probed the wound with his hand. The man groaned a deep, guttural moan. Jesse grabbed the bottle of whiskey he kept with him and slowly poured it over the wound. He heard the man gasp as the alcohol hit the bullet hole in his side. Jesse sloshed some over his hands and his knife before holding it to the fire. Slowly, gently, he slid the blade into the wound. There was a slight hiss of the hot knife on the flesh. A shudder ran through the brave as the blade went in. Jesse felt the hardness of the bullet through the handle of the knife. Now he knew where it was. "This is gonna hurt, but the bullet must come out." He pushed down hard with one hand around the wound while he sank his fingers into the wound. He could feel the lead with his fingertips. He pushed harder until he could grasp the metal with his fingers. He pulled it out, his hand covered in blood. He poured more whiskey into the wound, and he grabbed the .44 shells from his case, pried out the lead with his knife. 3 should be enough. He shook out the powder from the shells onto the wound, took a flaming branch from the fire and ignited the powder, covering his eyes as it flashed brightly. The powder burned, the woman screamed, the man cried out, and then lost consciousness. It was done. Jesse cleaned and dressed the wound, packing it tightly as he wrapped the clean rags he always carried around next to the body. Except for her cry, Running Doe had watched silently as the stranger went through all of this. He seemed to know what to do. She was too weak to stop him. When all was done, the man stepped outside to wash his hands in the snow. He crouched by the fire to warm them when he returned. He held out his canteen to her. Running Doe took it and drank the water in one long, slow pull. Jesse cut off some of the elk he had been cooking and gave it to her. She ate slowly, her fatigue dragging at her limbs. She looked at her husband and then back at Jesse. He'll sleep now for a while. Your man will wake up when the fever breaks. We'll see what the wound does. Do you understand me?" Running Doe nodded wearily, turned on her side, and went to sleep. Jesse pulled her blanket over her and tended the fire. He went out, settled the pinto, threw down more fodder for the hungry beast, and wondered what to do next. This was not in his plan. But then he had no plan except to ride the trail and check on the railway holdings. He did not want to start caring for these people. He had not cared for anyone or anything since he lost his family. He leaned the travois against the shack, eased himself back into the warm room. He tried to stay awake, but with his back to the wall, his eyes closed, sleep overtook him. He came to, checked on his 2 guests, and faded back into oblivion. He woke to the smell of coffee. Slowly he opened his eyes and saw the woman beside the fire with a pot in her hand. She poured a cup and handed it to him. He smiled and reached for the handle. He nodded his thanks and let the liquid warm him. Whatever else she did, she could sure make coffee. "Thank you for your help," she said plainly. "You have been very kind." "My pleasure, ma'am. If you don't mind my asking, what happened?" "You have heard of Sitting Bull?" "Oh, yes. Who hasn't? Saw him a while back in one of those Buffalo Bill Wild West shows. He rode around on his horse and cursed people in Lakota. I don't think they knew what he was saying." "Yes," she smiled. "He told me about that one afternoon while I was waiting for my husband. My husband was one of his guardians." "Guards, ma'am?" "No. My husband protected him." I see. Is that how your man was shot?" "Yes. The Lakota police came for Sitting Bull. There were shots. Sitting Bull was killed. My husband and others were wounded. I thought best to get away." "You walked all the way from Standing Rock? In this?" "Yes, it was all there was to do." I'm Jesse, ma'am. Jesse Cox." "I am called Running Doe." "Looks like you're about to drop a fawn, ma'am." Running Doe smiled at the words. It had been a long time since she'd smiled. "Only the deer does not give birth in the winter, does she?" "No, ma'am. Got more sense than that." "He will come soon, this man-child." "Just in time for Christmas." "Yes, just like baby Jesus born in a stable." "You know about Jesus, ma'am?" "Oh, yes. The white missionary on the reservation spoke of him. I know the story. I am a follower of the Father of Skies. I am, as you would say, a Christian. What of you, Mr. Jesse?" His eyes fell for a moment. "I don't believe in much, ma'am. I've seen too much evil to believe there's any good in the world." "There is always good, Mr. Jesse. What you have done for us is good. Helping my husband, that is good. Missionary, he is good. He helped us, brought us the good news about Jesus. This baby is good." She smiled as she rubbed her swollen belly. Jesse did not know what to say, and so he kept his silence. He leaned over and felt for the heat in the man's head. "His name is Weeping Fox." "His fever's broken." "If he'll keep sleeping, he'll heal, ma'am." "Oh, that is good. I was afraid for him. He was a ghost dancer. He believed with others that the white leather shirt would turn a bullet. Even though what was taught in the beginning was good, my people turned the good into a story to defeat the white man. We just wanted to live our lives." "Yes, ma'am. I guess that's what everybody wants." The silence fell between them, each wrapped in the truth of these words and what it had brought into the world. I best see to the animals, ma'am. I'll be right back." She nodded her assent, and he left. "You just stop it, Jesse Cox. You just stop it. You stop caring about these people. You just stop that. Caring about people brings nothing but trouble and hurt. You've had enough of that for a lifetime." He whispered these words to himself as he lay down the fodder for the animals and cleaned up around them as best he could. The snow had continued to fall through the night, wrapping everything in its whiteness. He lowered the elk meat and cut some for their breakfast. He didn't think he could look cold jerky in the face this morning. He shook and stamped to rid himself of the snow before he went back into the cabin. Running Doe was changing the dressing on her husband's wound. Already it was less inflamed and smelled better. She had heated some water and was washing his face and chest. He stirred a little as her hands passed over him. "Water." These were the first coherent words he had spoken in over a week. Quickly she lifted his head slightly and pressed the canteen to his lips. He swallowed. A smile passed over his face, and he sank back into a deep sleep, his breathing deep and regular. Running Doe finished bathing him and covered her husband again with the robe. How is he, ma'am?
He asked for water. Just the one word, but the only word he has spoken with sense for many days.
Well, that's good. Maybe he's going to make it. Have you thought about what you're going to do, where you're going to go?
The baby will come soon, I think. After that, we will keep heading west until we can go no further. I have heard of a town called Frisco. It is large, perhaps large enough for us to hide.
It's plenty large, ma'am. It's called San Francisco, and it is large. I was there once a while back. Lots of Chinese, Mexicans. Not so many Indians.
Are there other places, large places where we could go, where we could hide?
It's a big country, and on west there are big cities with a lot of people, but is that what you really want?
I do not want my child to know the fear of the white man. I do not want my child to know the poverty of the reservation. I do not want my child to live as we have lived. Is this so much to want, Mr. Jesse? Do you have children, Mr. Jesse? A wife?
I did once, ma'am, long ago. They were killed, murdered in the Civil War. You know of this war?
Oh, yes. I learned of it at the mission school. General Custer fought in this war, yes?
Yes, the fool. He had no business doing what he did, getting all his men killed. He was after the glory.
You do not think him a hero?
From what I heard, he disobeyed orders. He took a few hundred soldiers against several thousand Indians, and his arrogance got him in a battle he should never have fought. It was over in less than an hour, with his men scattered dead over half a mile. The Lakota, your people, ma'am, they were just defending themselves.
You are very different from the white men I have met, Mr. Jesse.
Is that a good thing, ma'am?
Yes, Mr. Jesse, it is a good thing. Mr. Jesse, would you tell me of your wife?
That was a long time ago, Running Doe. I don't talk about it. It changed me. It wounded me.
Perhaps, Mr. Jesse, it is like the wound of my husband. The bullet must be removed before the wound will heal. Like the bullet you took from my husband, it is harming you.
Ma'am, if I may say, you are not like any Indian woman I've ever met.
Have you met many?
Just you, ma'am.
Jesse took a deep breath and thought of what she had said. He began to speak of Rachel. He could see her in his mind's eye as clearly as the last day he saw her, as she waved goodbye as he left for war.
She had long brown hair and brown eyes. When she smiled, her whole face would light up. It was like she had a light inside her that would spill out when she smiled. My Rachel was filled with sweetness. The only time I ever saw her get mad was once when she saw a man kick a cat that was brushing up against him, and she marched right up to him even though he was taller and bigger, and she got into his face with her finger, and she asked him what the cat had ever done to him, and what if someone kicked him when he got in their way, and who did he think he was anyway? I laughed to see it. I laugh now. We'd known each other a long time when we were little. I'd fancied her for years before I got up the courage to ask her if I could court her. I had to ask her pa, and so we started courting, sitting on her front porch with her ma and pa listening from the front parlor. Some nights there wasn't much to hear but the crickets. We just sat there. I was too afraid to speak and worried I would say the wrong thing and her too nice to tell me to go. And after a while I asked her pa if we could get married, and he said he thought she was too good for me, and I said I thought so too, and he laughed and told me to go ahead. Rachel said yes, and we were married. We moved in with my folks for a bit because I was helping my father on our farm, and he gave me a piece of land. We built a house ourselves and moved in. Life went on. I'll never forget that day. She told me she was pregnant with Jacob. She hadn't been to the doctor, but she knew. Jacob was born, and I was as proud as a peacock. I built him a cradle. I made him some toys. Life was good. Then the war came along. I joined up out of duty, I suppose. I fought till the end. Got wounded a few days before General Lee surrendered, and I ended up in a field hospital, and all I wanted to do was go home and see my family. By the time I could get about, there wasn't a horse to be had and no money. I thought if I could just get home, everything would be all right. I started walking. It took weeks. That's how I know what you've been through. By the time I got home, it was too late. I found my Rachel dead on the floor of our bedroom. She was covered in flies. She had been attacked, Running Doe nodded. She had been attacked, and when I went looking for Jacob, I found him with his head smashed in. He was so little, helpless. I buried them both out in a grove near the house. I found some Confederate buttons and pieces of uniform. Went back to search the place for any signs of what happened. The stragglers they'd stolen everything worth stealing, and they'd left their clothes, took mine. I caught up with them in the next town. One of them was wearing my best suit and was trying to sell a cameo I had bought for Rachel one Christmas. And I followed them. I followed them where they were camping in the woods, and I killed them all. I should have killed myself alongside of Rachel, but I was too big a coward to do that. My parents were dead by then. The carpetbaggers had come in. They'd taken everything, all the farms for taxes. I just started heading west, running away, and I've been running ever since. I see Rachel and Jacob in my dreams, and the faces of the men I killed in my nightmares. Maybe I'm not the nice man you think I am, and that's why I don't have much time for God. If there's a God, why does he let bad things like that happen? What did my Rachel, my Jacob ever done to him? By now the tears were flowing down his face, disappearing into his beard. Running Doe was crying as well because she now understood the weight he carried. Mr. Jesse, these are evil things. Evil things happen. Not because the Father of skies is evil, but because we are evil. The evil is within us. Why my Rachel, my Jacob? I do not know, Mr. Jesse. These are hard questions. Questions that only the Father of skies can answer. I know that sometimes he tells us why, but sometimes he does not. Do you know the story of Job in the Bible? Oh yeah, I know about old Job. He had a rough time, had all those sores and a nagging wife. Running Doe smiled. He lost his riches, his health, his children, but he would not curse God. In the end, when the Father of skies appeared in the whirlwind, the Father asked, "Where were you when I made the earth?" This I know, Mr. Jesse. The Father is good and knows all things. I do not know why my man was shot. I do not know why the Father of skies drove me across the Dakotas. I do not know why my baby will be born here in the middle of the wilderness in the deep snow, but I know the Father of skies is with me. I know he holds me in his hand. Let the Father of skies hold you in his hand, Mr. Jesse. Let him remove the bullet from your wound. The silence fell between them. Then Jesse stood and walked out of the cabin into the snowy night. Running Doe lifted her hands and began to chant slowly to the Father of skies, praying for her husband and this stranger, Jesse, that God had brought into her life. Jesse waded deep into the woods through the drifted snow.
Hot tears were flowing down his cheeks, cooling and frosting on his face and beard. He pulled his knife from his belt and he placed the razor edge against his throat. His breath was coming in ragged sobs, and his sorrow and anger overtook him. He tensed his arm, ready to draw the blade across his throat and spill his blood on the virgin snow to end his life. But he did not. He stood there frozen in time, with the blade growing cold against his skin, his chest slowly heaving with each labored breath. He shouted a deep, guttural moan as he plunged the knife into the bark of the tree in front of him, again and again and again, releasing his anger and his sorrow, and he fell to his knees in the deep snow of the cold, wrapping him in its embrace. Oh, dear God, I've been running from you a long time, and I am so tired. My mama knew you, my daddy knew you, my Rachel knew you, heard about you all my life. Forgive me. Forgive me my sin, my anger, my hate. Forgive me for killing those men who killed my family. And I don't know what to do about that, but it's been a long time, and I reckon you'll show me. Take me, God. Save me like the old chaplain talked about before the battles. That's all I know to say. Amen. Suddenly he felt warmth surround him as Running Doe placed her buffalo robe about his shoulders. She had come up behind him silently in the snow. Mr. Jesse, come now. Come back with me out of the snow, out of the cold. Come. He rose and allowed her to lead him back into the cabin, feeling its warmth surround him as he entered, and the warmth inside his heart as it began to heal. The bullet's out, Running Doe. The bullet's out. God just plunged his hand into my heart and pulled it right out, just like I did for Weeping Fox. My fever's gone. I can start to heal. Her eyes turned to her husband as he continued to sleep the sleep that would bring him back to her. She turned back to Jesse. This is good, Mr. Jesse. This is good. Now you can have Christmas in peace. Oh, Running Doe, I forgot all about Christmas. It's tomorrow. Jesse went about the normal chores of caring for the animals, spreading the fodder he had brought. He began to cast his mind about for what he could give his unexpected guests for Christmas, now that it seemed that he was going to celebrate it after all. Running Doe seemed fine. A burst of energy moving her to sweep out the cabin with her hands, clear out the cobwebs, straighten anything that could be straightened. Jesse gathered wood, melted snow for water, dragged the branches and small cedars to give the animals a break against the wind and the cold. He cleared more snow away from the cabin. Weeping Fox continued to sleep, a deep, healing sleep, coming to the surface just long enough to take sips of water from the canteen Running Doe held to his lips. The winter's light began to fade. The cold bore down with the night. Jesse had made some sourdough from starter, baking it in the Dutch oven he always carried. A stew simmered in the fire made from the elk, some wizened carrots and potatoes. Running Doe and Jesse sat silently on the floor, wrapped in their own thoughts, while Weeping Fox continued to sleep, his soft, deep breathing loud in the quiet. Mr. Jesse, it is Christmas Eve. Would you like to read the Christmas story? Why, sure, ma'am, but I mean, what will I read it from? I know the story. My mama used to tell us that story when we were small, but I remember the preacher reading it from church, but I don't think I could get close to what the Bible says. Oh, I have a Bible, Mr. Jesse. Running Doe reached into their bundle under the small bed and brought out the black cloth-bound Bible, its worn edges curled with use. She turned to the passage in Luke where the nativity story was recorded. Here, Mr. Jesse, you read for us. Jesse took the Bible, tipped it toward the light of the fire, and began to read. Slowly at first, because it had been a long time since he'd read anything. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. All went to be taxed, every one to his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, into the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. Running Doe smiled a small smile and held her belly in her hands, picturing the child within her. Jesse continued. So it was that while they were there, these days were accomplished that she should be delivered. A short gasp came from Running Doe as a contraction came, short and sharp. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night. Lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them. They were sore afraid. Yeah, I'll bet they were. Being out in the field, seeing a bunch of angels showing up, that would scare me to death. And the angel said unto them, Fear not. Fear not. For behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you. You shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. And suddenly there were with the angels a multitude of the heavenly hosts, praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. And it came to pass, as the angels were gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, Let us go now even unto Bethlehem, and see this thing which come to pass, which the Lord hath made known to us. And they came with haste, and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger. And when they had seen it, they made known abroad the saying which was told them concerning this child. And all they heard was wondered those things which were told them by the shepherds. But Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. And the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things that they had heard and seen, as it was told unto them. And when 8 days were accomplished for the circumcising of the child, his name was called Jesus, which was so named of the angel before he was conceived in the womb. When the days of her purification according to the law of Moses were accomplished, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as it is written in the law of the Lord, Every male that openeth the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. And to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And behold, there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. The same man was just and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Ghost was upon him, and it was revealed to him by the Holy Ghost that he should not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. And he came by the Spirit into the temple when the parents brought him in the child Jesus to do for him after the custom of the law. Then they took him up to his arms. He took him up in his arms and blessed God and said, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared for the face of all the people, a light to enlighten the Gentiles, the glory to thy people Israel. And Joseph and his mother marveled at those things which were spoken of him. And Simeon blessed them and said unto Mary his mother, Behold, this child is set for the fall and rising of many in Israel, for a sign which shall be spoken against. Yea, a sword shall pierce through thine own soul also, and the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. And there was one Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher, and she was of a great age, and had lived with her husband 7 years from her virginity, and she was a widow about 84 years, which departed not from the temple, but served God with fasting and prayer night and day. And she coming in that instant gave thanks likewise to the Lord, and spake of him all them that looked for redemption in Jerusalem. When they had performed all the things according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city, Nazareth. And the child grew and waxed strong in spirit, and filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon them. Jesse finished reading and smiled.
Weeping Fox turned slowly on his side and spoke, his voice weak and cracked. "Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jesse. It is good to wake and hear those words. I must have heard your name in my waking dream. Thank you for your help. I am in your debt." "There are no debtors here, Weeping Fox. How are you feeling?" "Better. Since you plunged your hand inside me to remove the bullet festering within, but I am weak. I could eat something if there is food." The aroma of the stew had filled the cabin and reminded them they were all hungry. "Will you say thanks, my husband?" "Father of skies, we thank you for this which you have made. We thank you for making the elk to walk in the woods with his great size to feed many. We thank you for making the potatoes and the carrots to grow in the earth, which you also have made. I thank you for guiding us to this place to meet the one who would help us. Father of skies, we thank and worship you. Amen." Running Doe ladled out the stew in the dented tin plates Jessie had given her. They ate in silence, sopping up the gravy with the sourdough bread. They passed the canteen around, each taking a long draw. "There is coffee." The aroma filled the hut, mingling with the savory smell of the stew. "I'll have some of that, please." "Water," said Weeping Fox. Running Doe pressed the cup into Jessie's hands and helped her husband drink from the canteen. He was still very weak. I could do with something sweet. How about you, Weeping Fox?" "Sweet?" "Yes, sweet. Sweet." "What do you have, Mr. Jesse?" "Molasses. Molasses on bread, just the thing." Jesse reached deep into his pack and brought out a jar of sorghum molasses. He handed it to Running Doe, who took some of the sourdough bread that was left, cut it in half, and poured molasses onto the bread. She handed Jesse a dripping piece. He caught the excess on his finger and put it in his mouth. Next, she held a piece for her husband, who took a small bite from her hand. The eating had used up what energy he had. A smile creased his face as the sweetness filled his mouth. "I like molasses. White man oppress Indian. White man keep molasses from Indian. Indian fight for molasses." Jesse smiled, clouded as he held the bread to his lips. A look of hurt and worry crossed his face. "I tease you, Mr. Jesse. Molasses is good. Thank you." The bread continued to Jesse's mouth, and he smiled a sticky smile as Running Doe laughed at his discomfort. Suddenly, Running Doe gasped and grabbed her belly. "The baby is coming now." She put her hand on the side of the shack and levered her way up. She rushed to the door, holding her hand beneath her belly. Jesse started after her, but Weeping Fox called him back. No, let her go. "She'll freeze. The baby will freeze." "She must do this alone. It is our way. Leave her. With no woman here, she will have the baby on her own. It is our way." Running Doe stumbled through the drifts of snow. Even as she held her belly, her eyes were searching for a place to have the child. There is a place." A small tree grew in a hollow on the ground. As the contractions went through her, she began to kick at the snow. Then she grabbed a fallen branch and swept a clear place. Next, she began tearing at the branches of the fir tree and laying them on the place where she had cleared, stopping to let the pain wash through her and give a low, guttural growl with each pain. Finally, the place was ready to catch the baby. She grabbed the tree, squatted, and began to push with each contraction. The men could hear her groans, and it was all Jesse could do to keep from going to her, helping her, but Weeping Fox, his face of stone, stopped him. "She will make place to have the baby. She will use a tree to help her. The baby will drop to the ground. She will cut and tie the cord and clean the baby with snow. Then she will return." You can't just leave her to do this on her own." "She will do this. It is the way of the women with child." They could hear the noises getting louder and louder as the contractions grew. Finally, there was a long, low growl and then silence. A baby's cry broke the stillness, and the men smiled. "I think we will call him Jesse Snow Elk." "Him?" "Running Doe thinks it is a boy." I think we'll know soon enough.
They could hear the soft cry of the newborn and Running Doe's step through the snow. The shack door swung open, and Running Doe stepped in with the baby in her arms. "You have a son. What will you call him?"
"I think he will be called Jesse Snow Elk, for the two that have saved us, Jesse who sheltered us and the elk that fed us."
"He will be called Jesse Snow Elk."
Running Doe sat by the fire and began softly crooning to the baby, slowly rocking back and forth. Jesse stood with his mouth open and his brows furrowed. You just had a baby."
"Yes."
"When a white woman has a baby, she stays in bed as weak as water."
"Jesse, I have just crossed the Dakotas with the baby and my husband. I am sitting by the fire. That is enough. It is our way."
Weeping Fox smiled at the strength of his wife and for his newborn son. Jesse sat amazed at Running Doe's strength. Soon she began to nurse the baby, covered by the blanket from the bed. Jesse could hear the soft sucking noises and the low coo the baby made as he ate. It brought back the feeling he'd had when Jacob was born, and he rejoiced inside that God had brought joy and feeling back into his heart again. Weeping Fox had fallen asleep again. Running Doe closed her eyes, resting with the baby in her arms. Jesse went out and checked on the animals again, making sure all was secure as it would be in the wilderness. He had decided what to give his guests, his friends, for Christmas. He went through in his mind as eager for Christmas morning now as he had been many long years ago. He went back into the shack, wrapped himself in a buffalo robe, and slept. He heard the baby in the night, and Running Doe caring for her child. He would come just to the edges of wakefulness and then slide back down into the peace of sleep. Jesse woke again to the aroma of coffee and bacon frying in a pan. He could also smell something baking. He opened his eyes to see almost every pan he possessed brought into service for this breakfast. Weeping Fox was sitting upright with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "Good, Jesse, you are awake. I thought I would have to shake you."
"Christmas morning, breakfast is ready." Again Weeping Fox prayed, and Running Doe served out coffee, bacon, hoe cake covered in elk gravy. Running Doe had made a place for the baby in a nest of buffalo robes and blankets. He was sleeping. They finished their meal, each replete with the warm food.
"Weeping Fox, Running Doe, it's Christmas, and I don't know if you know about white man's custom of Christmas, but it's giving presents."
"Yes, we know of this."
"Yes, we do know of this, but on the reservation there is little to give. But we know this tradition. Well, I have something for you, for Christmas."
Jesse reached into his pack and pulled out 3 bundles.
"For you, Weeping Fox."
He handed the first bundle to Weeping Fox. It was a long, narrow, and wrapped in doeskin. Weeping Fox pulled the bow of string leather wrapped around the package. He began to unroll it. As the last fold fell open, there in his hands was a large hunting knife. It had a handle of bone. The blade burned with the image of the fire in the lantern.
"I traded a fella for that blade a while back. It's a good blade, good steel, all the way from Germany," he said. "Anyway, I made the handle. I carved it myself for myself, but, well, I want you to have it."
Weeping Fox's eyes glowed with the knife.
"Never have I had such a knife. Thank you, Mr. Jesse."
Jesse handed the next small bundle to Running Doe. Her eyes looked down as she took the small gift from his hands, but a smile of pleasure and anticipation curled around her lips. She slowly began to unwrap this package. She gasped as she held the unwrapped package in her hand. It was Rachel's cameo. "I cannot accept this, Mr. Jesse. It is too much. This belonged to your Rachel."
"I think she would want you to have it. Please, accept it, wear it, with joy."
Slowly she untied the beaded necklace from around her throat. She took the cameo and attached it to the middle of the beads she always wore. It fell almost hidden in the folds of her jerkin. Finally he gave her another package. It rattled as she took it, and when she opened it, she found that was what it was, a carved bone rattle for the baby. It was Jacob's. I carved it before he was born. I've carried it with me for a long time now, and, well, I want you to have it for your baby. Oh, thank you, Mr. Jesse. I know what this must mean to you. Thank you. There's one more thing I'd like to give you. I'd like to give you a place to stay. I've got this ranch, and it's not big as ranches go, but it has a cabin and land and a barn. I'd like for you, well, all three of you, to come and live with me. It's out of the way, but it'll be a safe place to raise your family. And we'll build a place for you as soon as winter's over, and I'm gone a fair bit, and, well, it would help me to have someone there all the time. There's hunting and fishing, and, there's cattle to care for and help them feed the railway workers, and, well, it's a good place. What do you say? It's a lot closer than San Francisco. Weeping Fox looked at Running Doe. She nodded and smiled. We will come, Mr. Jesse. You have rescued us from the cold and from harm. Thank you. No, Weeping Fox. It is you who have rescued me. The end.